Hello and welcome to our session, A Hard Look in the Mirror, Race and American Democracy. I'm Jeanne Meserve. There is a fundamental contradiction in American democracy. There always has been. We are governed by a constitution which says all men are created equal, but for many people that rings false. And issues around that, matters of race, have been center stage in our political discourse, particularly in the last year, whether we're talking about policing or the justice system or economic equity or even health equity. Here with us to look at this complicated relationship between race and democracy is Colorado State Representative Leslie Herod. Representative Herod was first elected in 2016. She is the first LGBTQ state representative, African-American, to serve in Colorado's General Assembly. Great to have you with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
I want to ask you first to look back on the events of January 6th. And tell me how you, as an African-American and also as an elected official, felt when you saw a Confederate flag being walked through the US Capitol.
It shook me to my core. And I think that while maybe I wasn't as surprised to see it happening, I was hurt. I was hurt to see a Confederate flag flown in Washington, D.C. at the U.S. Capitol, where it had never flown before. It told me and reminded me in such a harsh way that white supremacy, right, and this fight to oppose progress for Black people was very much alive and well, and that folks were willing to take over our democracy, to take over our country, to ensure that progress was not made. And, my good friend was there, U.S. Congressman Joe Neguse, and he was on the floor when this was happening. And there were attempts to kill him. Right. I mean, that was a part of what was going on in that day, in that moment. There was, and I will say that I was afraid for him as a Black man being there, as a Black man representing us. That was a very scary time. And make no mistake, there was a noose hanging out in front of the U.S. Capitol as well. So this display of white supremacy and racism in our country, it's harmful. It upset me so much because it showed me how weak and shaky our democracy actually is.
That's what I wanted to ask you as a follow-up, is what does it say about American democracy when we have that kind of demonstration inside the Capitol?
Yeah, it just shows you how unstable and how shaky our ground is, but how our foundation has been built on that white supremacy. And to see so many people who are saying that we don't want progress for Black people, for Jewish folks. I mean, there's so much anti-Semitism in that crowd as well. It was a powerful reckoning and reality of where we are as a country and how far we still have to go. And it just told me that we have so much more work to do. But I'm not going to lie, I cried for our country in that moment.
So there are those who posit that the central issue that's causing this polarization and the extremism on the right is actually economic disenfranchisement. Do you think it's about economics, or is this about race?
It's about privilege and race and white supremacy. And I think to think it is only economics continues to not acknowledge the real roots of racism in this country. It's not just about economics. I think it is clearly about privilege and about feeling like if a person of color, Black person, a Jewish person, is to progress in the society, it means that the white man will get less, right? And must come down. And that's not necessarily true. We can all rise together, but we must rise in a way that is truly equal. And that turns its back on such racism, So it is not just about economics. And let me be honest with you. I think we have brainwashed ourselves in America, especially those of us, and I do say us, with privilege, to think that it's all about economics. But let me tell you, the number one factor that determines an outcome of a person is their race and their zip code. It's not necessarily their economic status. And so regardless of how much money I have or the title that I wear as a state legislator, I am first and foremost a Black woman who will still be disproportionately likely to be pulled over by the police, who will disproportionately have negative health outcomes. And yes, my economic stability and intergenerational wealth is less.
A lot of people of color are disillusioned with democracy and just think it is not working for them. You, on the other hand, have jumped into it with both feet. I'm curious as to why you chose to get involved in politics, given the status of African Americans, the situation of African Americans in this country.
Yeah. Well, I disagree that that people of color have given up on democracy. I actually don't think that's true. And it's apparent by how many of us have turned out across this country, either in elections or to be elected, right?
Yeah, and I want to talk more about that in just a moment, for sure.
So I just disagree with that point. And in fact, I say that Black folks love this country so much more than maybe we should sometimes, right? Than maybe this country deserves. But we still believe at our core that of these American principles of progress, right? Of being able to live in a society that's equal and have a better outcome for our kids than ourselves. We hope for that. We believe in that. We just don't always think in the moment that it will happen.
You've alluded to the fact that this was the year of the Black woman in politics. It was quite an amazing thing here in the US. Do you think that's going to create real change in the United States?
Oh, absolutely. 100%. When you have people who are diverse, and who have firsthand experience around the policies that are trying to be changed at the state level, at the city level, at the federal level, you get better policy, you get better bills. And quite frankly, more Black women in these positions will lead to better outcomes for Black people. Make no mistake. And I also believe that Black women in these positions have fundamentally changed the conversation. We've changed what's even important, and we've set an agenda that will begin, I believe, to right the wrongs of this country's past.
And yet, now, in reaction to that election, in many states, there are moves to restrict voting access. What does that say, again, about the state of American democracy, that that's the response?
It says that people with privilege want to keep their power, and that they see that there has been a tide that has moved so swiftly and so powerfully towards equality, including equal representation, that of course there is a backlash. Of course, people want to say that democracy is for me, but not for you, or not for them. And that's something that we must resist at all odds, in every single manner, because what they are trying to do is fundamentally keep Black women, Black people, people of color, Indigenous folks, brown folks from being elected, from having representation, and from voicing their opinions at the ballot box.
Are you convinced that you can turn back those efforts to restrict voting?
Absolutely. Listen, people are paying attention. They are showing up. And they are saying, we will no longer allow for this type of discrimination in this country. And make no mistake, it's not just people of color. It's our white allies and champions too, who are seeing through these subversive methods of keeping us from the ballot. It might not read exactly like the discrimination that happened throughout the South to keep Black people from voting, but it's very close. And if you read between the lines, you will see the similarities in restricting access to people of color in the South, Black people in the South back in the day, to what people are trying to do now with things like voter ID laws and trying to talk about this voter fraud that, quite frankly, is not an issue.
Aside from assigning yourself a D for Democrat, how would you define yourself politically?
Yeah, I'm a progressive. I believe that we need to move this country forward. And I know there are forces on the other side who would like to keep the status quo or even roll back the progress we've made in the past 10 years. And so I believe that we need to continue to fight to dismantle the bricks of white supremacy that have been built up in this country for so long. And that's in all of those sectors I previously mentioned: education, criminal justice, economic development, and so many, healthcare, environmental. All of these areas we need to address, to have a very real conversation about the harms that have been done to our communities because of these policies, and then we need to change them.
Talk to me about the reality working in Colorado in the State House. Are you able to get support for some of those progressive sorts of initiatives from people on the other side of the aisle?
Absolutely. Listen, in my few years at the state capitol, I have passed over 70 bills. Majority of them have been bipartisan. It's very interesting because while I might not agree with my colleagues on every issue, there's usually one or two that I could speak to one or two of them and help to build consensus on both sides of the aisle. What I find is that when you shine a bright light on what's going on, people tend to stop being ignorant and no longer hide behind ignorance and say, you know what? This is a problem and I'm going to get behind you and address it. Just because you have an R behind your name does not make you a white supremacist, just to be honest. And just because you have a D behind your name doesn't mean that you are moving things forward in a progressive way to support people of color. I've seen Democrats and Republicans turn their backs on us. And so what I'm working to do is to strip down the notion of D versus R and say, who will join me in this fight for equality?
And do you feel that by doing that, you've been able to reduce the polarization?
The polarization is getting worse. I'm just going to be clear about that. It is getting worse because the rhetoric is so intense. But what I have found is while I don't think that I have been able to decrease the polarization, I have been able to increase my chances of winning and our chances of winning by pulling over folks that we can on certain conversations. It does not make them any less contentious just because I have a white conservative by my side. But what it does do is it increases our chances of winning.
So are the lessons you've learned there applicable to Washington? Are they those same techniques being used there, or do you wish there was somebody doing more along the lines of what you're talking about?
Honestly, a lot of the bills that move forward in Washington are bipartisan, but it doesn't mean that by and large the entire caucus agrees with them, but we have enough to move things forward. Washington is built to move slow, and that's something else that we have to think about. The way that our democracy works at the federal level is inherently built to keep the status quo. And so you do see a lot of folks who are really pushing things harder and further and faster. And that makes a lot of people who are part of the establishment uncomfortable. You don't find that same slow movement at the state level, at least not here in Colorado. We have made strides and gains and leaps and bounds, and we hope to be a model for other states and for the nation. And that is because of our bipartisanship on our bills. But I don't want to give myself too big of a pat on the back, or Colorado too big of a pat on the back. It can still be divisive.
So after the killing of unarmed Black men and women last year, there were massive social justice protests across the country, but there's been backlash to that. I'm wondering if you've been targeted.
With violence?
Yes.
Oh, absolutely. I have definitely had death threats. I've had credible attacks where I've had to have private security as well as Colorado State Patrol. Black women and women of color in these roles and who are pushing progressive policy and speaking our truth are definitely targeted for attacks and hatred and bullying and harassment, more so than our counterparts. And that is something real, and it's not something that we should accept or we should excuse. People shouldn't say that you got into this, you should know what you're getting yourself into, because the risk of being murdered is not something that should be tolerated by any of us. It should not be accepted. And I think that is something that we need to continue to address. But I will not let terrorists, because that's who those people are terrorists, keep me from making progress for my communities.
So you haven't felt intimidated enough to walk away from your current
No,
job?
in fact, it's like, if they're going to come after me anyways, I damn well better make sure this policy is strong and it's going to have a real impact on people's lives.
How do we get past it? Some people have suggested maybe we should have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission as they did in South Africa and Rwanda. Are you of the opinion that something like that could actually have an effect?
I do think it could have an effect. And I do think that we need to really have a truth and reconciliation about how this country has harmed people of color, Indigenous folks, low-income folks, Black folks, brown, all of us, right? Did people who are differently abled. It's so very important that we have this conversation. And I think it does start with addressing our racism in this country. We have to address that. So I do think that will make progress, but I don't think we need to wait until the outcomes of such a conversation occur for us to make change. We can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can have these very difficult conversations and dismantle the policies that we know are in place that are harmful for our communities.
Do you find irony in the fact that the United States promotes democracy and human rights abroad, and yet within the United States, we're still grappling with these issues?
Well, that's an interesting question. I grew up as a military brat. I was born in Germany. I lived overseas a lot. And I learned what the American values are and who we are as a country in other countries, and seeing how people view America and Americans. And then when I spent more time here in this country, I realized that our ideals of who we are as Americans are just ideals, and our ideals of American democracy are ideals. And we are not doing enough to live our values and live who we say we are, or who we want other people to be in other countries. If we actually took our values and how we are trying to spread democracy and open elections and all of this, and applied that lens to how we move in this space, in this country, we would be better off.
So you mentioned that the truth and reconciliation idea is a very big one. It would take time. You clearly are engaged in conversations as a lawmaker, but I'm wondering if you've got other ideas for other ways to grapple with this now.
Well, I think we do need to have very intentional conversations. We need to elect more people of color into these offices. We need more people of color as teachers, as professors, as doctors, as lawyers, in all of these positions, so that we can dismantle the racism and white supremacy in the spaces that we are in, which could be our homes, our clinics, our workplaces. That is very important. And so, we know a lot of the policies that are put in place that are based in racism. We know our school finance formula, for instance, and how we fund education is not equitable. Let's change it. We know our criminal justice system disproportionately impacts people of color. Let's change it. There are things that have been studied that we know, that we have acknowledged. The war on drugs targeted us. We know these things. Let's change them. We don't need another study to tell us that. But I think in order for us to really move forward as a soul, as a nation, as a culture, we need to have those truth and reconciliation conversations.
Just one other question about foreign policy, since you've lived overseas. Do you think that American foreign policy abroad has too often ignored issues of race and equity in other countries?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think it depends on which decade you're looking at.
How about the here and now?
Well, I mean, I know that the Biden administration is taking a very different approach to our conversation overseas than the Trump administration has, to be clear. We are moving a lot further and quicker on issues of things like equality for women and LGBTQ equality and safety. But again, I think the anti-Blackness and racism, it's worldwide. And no, I don't think we're doing enough to address those issues in other countries. But again, who are we? Who are we to say that our values are the ones that matter more than anyone else's? In fact, we've got to take a good hard look in our own mirror before we try to export our ideas.
Representative Leslie Herod, we have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us today. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
And now we're going to take a live look at Cal with the economist, who is our artist in residence, and see how his cartooning's going.